Why do we need to fight against each other? This question transcends the centuries, echoing in the ruins of ancient civilizations, in peace treaties signed in marble halls, and more recently, in the polarized debates that dominate social media. In a world that considers itself civilized, enlightened, and advanced, why does the impulse for conflict persist? Why do societies that build cathedrals, museums, and universities also build weapons, armies, and battlefields? And more disturbingly, why, even in times of apparent peace, do individuals continue to create enemies in their daily lives, projecting hostility onto colleagues, neighbors, strangers, even onto those closest to them? War, contrary to what one might like to believe, is not an aberration that occurs only in times of crisis or at the hands of tyrannical leaders. It is a profound manifestation of the human psyche, an archaic pattern rooted in both our biological instincts and the social architecture we have shaped throughout history. From the earliest tribal communities to modern complex states, the impulse to fight has not disappeared. It has merely transformed. The battlefield may have migrated from forests and plains to digital stages and institutional spaces, but the logic of war continues to operate in the shadows of human behavior. This video proposes a bold analysis. War is not an isolated event, but a recurring symptom of unconscious forces that traverse cultures and epochs. Forces fueled by fear, the need for control, and the projection of one's own shadow. Concepts developed by thinkers such as Carl Jung, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Michel Foucault. Understanding the psychological and historical origins of this phenomenon is essential not only for grasping the armed conflicts that mark our world, but also for recognizing how these same dynamics shape our daily behaviors. In personal rivalries, political disputes, ideological polarizations, and the small confrontations that permeate everyday life. Throughout this video, you will be invited to look beyond the usual simplifications, exploring how war, visible or invisible, continues to shape our identity and our relationships. And more, you will be challenged to reflect on your own role in this cycle and how awareness of these forces can open a path to personal and collective transformation. Because, in the end, the fundamental question is not just why we fight, but how can we stop fighting against each other, against the world, and against ourselves? To understand why humans insist on fighting one another, it is not enough to look only at modern conflicts. It is necessary to open the older layers of history, to literally dig into the ancestral soils of humanity. For millennia, the myth of the noble savage was believed, a view popularized by Rousseau and perpetuated by currents of romantic thought. The idea that, in prehistoric times, man lived in harmony with his peers and with nature, and that it was civilization, with its institutions and power structures, that corrupted this primitive peace. But archaeology, in the last 50 years, has brutally challenged this idealized view. In War Before Civilization, archaeologist Lawrence Keeley presents a grim picture of human past. He documents with scientific detail that war is as old as humanity itself. At archaeological sites in Europe, Asia, and the Americas, the evidence leaves no doubt. Skeletons with arrow marks, skulls fractured by blows from clubs, rudimentary walls erected to protect villages from attacks. In some regions, more than 20% of the skeletons discovered in prehistoric cemeteries show clear signs of violent death. These are not exceptions. They are a pattern. The first farmers of Neolithic Europe, for example, built their villages surrounded by ditches and defensive palisades. And these were not decorative elements. They were structures erected with collective effort in response to a real and constant fear. War, far from being an sporadic phenomenon, was part of everyday life. Keeley estimates that the rates of mortality from violence in these pre-state societies were much higher than in the industrialized societies of the 20th century, even considering the world wars. But primitive war was not motivated solely by economic or territorial gains. Pierre Clastres, in his seminal work Society Against the State, proposes an intriguing reading. For many indigenous societies, waging war was a way to avoid tyranny. In these groups, the political structure deliberately opposed the centralization of power. Leaders often did not possess coercive authority. Their role was more symbolic than governmental. External conflict served paradoxically as an internal regulator. Keeping groups in a constant state of mobilization prevented the emergence of a dominant elite. War, in this context, was not just a means of survival, but an instrument of social balance. This panorama forces us to reconsider our more comfortable notions about human nature. The impulse for conflict was not introduced by civilization, nor is it an accident of historical development. It emerges from something deeper, from a psychic need that seems to traverse cultures and epochs. The creation of an other, of an enemy, has always been fundamental to the construction of collective identity. Defining who we are inevitably requires defining who we are not. Thus, since the earliest times, war has shaped not only territories and political boundaries, but also myths, beliefs, and the very symbolic fabric of human societies. However, this leads us to a more unsettling question. Is war merely a reflection of historical and social circumstances? Or is there, rooted in each individual, a biological impulse, an ancestral drive that leads us to combat and destroy the other? To explore this darker and more intimate dimension, it is necessary to delve into the territory of philosophy and deep psychology. Because if war began in the fields and villages of prehistory, today it continues within the human mind. And it is precisely along this path that we will follow. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. War is not just a historical or social phenomenon. Reducing human conflicts to disputes over territory or resources would ignore a much more unsettling dimension: the fact that the impulse for conflict is inscribed in the very constitution of the human psyche. To understand it in all its depth, it is necessary to turn not only to archaeology and history, but also to philosophy and psychology, to the ground where great thinkers sought to understand the true nature of man. Thomas Hobbes, in Leviathan, formulated a brutal and lucid view of the human condition. For Hobbes, in his natural state, man is not a peaceful being. He is driven by fears and desires that place him in constant competition with others. Without a strong central power to regulate their actions, individuals would inevitably tend to devour one another. Hence, his famous maxim, "Man is a wolf to man." In this scenario, war is not an exception but the natural state of human relations. Peace, on the other hand, is a fragile construction maintained only by structures of power and the threat of punishment. Jean-Jacques Rousseau offered a different but equally revealing perspective. For him, primitive man was peaceful and free, but was corrupted by the emergence of private property and social institutions. In this process, inequality was born, and with it, conflict. War, in this sense, would be a product of civilization, not of human nature. However, even in Rousseau, there remains the recognition that the desire for domination, once awakened, takes deep root in the hearts of men. Freud, in turn, in Civilization and its Discontents, went even deeper. For him, the impulse for conflict arises from an innate drive, the death instinct, or thanatos. Each individual carries within them a destructive impulse that needs to be controlled and sublimated for civilization to function. But this impulse never completely disappears. Under pressure, it erupts, manifesting itself in acts of violence, intolerance, and war. Freud describes civilization as a field of constant tension between eros, the impulse for life and union, and thanatos, the impulse for destruction. Thus, from Hobbes to Freud, a disturbing picture emerges. War is not an occasional aberration. but a direct or sublimated expression of impulses that inhabit us all. It is not the other that makes us go to war. It is something within us that projects onto the other the enemy to be fought. And here arises an even deeper and more unsettling concept, that of the shadow, developed by Carl Gustav Jung. According to Jung, all human beings carry in their unconscious a repressed part of themselves, dark aspects, fears, unacceptable desires that cannot be integrated into the image we construct of ourselves. This shadow, when unrecognized and unworked, tends to be projected onto others. The enemy becomes the receptacle of the qualities we reject in ourselves. It is through this projection that conflict feeds and perpetuates itself. War, ultimately, is the externalization of our internal battles. But if the impulse for war arises in the unconscious, if it is fueled by the shadow and deep drives, then the question that arises is, how are these forces manipulated, amplified, and directed by power structures? Who benefits from the constant creation of enemies? For this, we need to understand not only psychology, but also discourse. It is time to move to a new level of analysis, to explore how power organizes and legitimizes war. If war emerges from deep impulses of the human psyche, it is in the projection of the shadow that we find one of its most powerful and insidious mechanisms. Carl Gustav Jung dedicated a significant part of his work to exploring what he called the shadow, the set of impulses, desires, memories, and aspects of personality that the conscious ego rejects, represses, and hides. But what is denied does not disappear. On the contrary, it gains strength in the unconscious, seeking ways to manifest itself. The projection of the shadow is an inevitable phenomenon. When individuals and collectives do not recognize their own flaws, insecurities, and dark impulses, they end up projecting these qualities onto the other. The enemy, then, is not a real figure, but a psychic construction, shaped by everything we do not want to admit in ourselves. Thus, entire populations become capable of seeing in another group an ethnicity, a nation, a religion, an ideology, the embodiment of evil, the threat, the existential danger. Nietzsche, in On the Genealogy of Morals, went further by showing that much of what we call morality arises from resentment, a feeling of powerlessness and inferiority that transforms into moral superiority. When unable to act directly on their own shadow, the moralistic man attributes all the evils of the world to the other. Hatred of the enemy is therefore not a simple reactive emotion. It is a sophisticated product of self-deception, a means of preserving a self-image of purity and righteousness. This process is not abstract. It has concrete and lethal consequences. When a collective projects its shadow onto another group, it opens the door to dehumanization. And dehumanization is the necessary step to justify violence. History is full of examples. Propaganda campaigns that portrayed entire peoples as barbarians, parasites, subhumans. Each genocide, each ideological war, each political persecution was preceded by a symbolic work of enemy construction. An enemy that, in fact, was nothing more than a dark reflection of the very society that created it. This dynamic has not disappeared with modernity. On the contrary, it has become more sophisticated. Today, communication technologies and social networks amplify the processes of projection and polarization in unprecedented ways. Each political conflict, each cultural debate quickly transforms into a Manichaean arena. On one side, the good; on the other, the evil. Language becomes laden with moralism, and opponents cease to be seen as complex human beings. They are reduced to caricatures, enemies to be defeated, humiliated, eliminated. In times of crisis, this psychological need intensifies. The greater the fear, uncertainty, and sense of powerlessness, the greater the temptation to find a scapegoat. The collective shadow seeks a channel for its discharge, and leaders, whether aware of this mechanism or not, can skillfully exploit these emotions, directing popular hatred against a convenient target. The external enemy, real or invented, becomes the instrument to consolidate power, unite factions, and justify authoritarian measures. Therefore, to understand how human beings continue to create enemies and perpetuate the logic of war, it is essential to recognize that the enemy, before being a real adversary, is a psychic construction. It is the mirror that allows us not to look at ourselves. But who builds this mirror? Who shapes the narratives that feed fear and hatred? For this, it is necessary to enter the realm of discourse and power. And that is precisely where we are headed now. War does not arise solely from instinctive impulses or unconscious projections. It is, above all, constructed through language, images, symbols, and narratives that shape our perception of the world. The power of words is immense. With them, it is possible to transform a human being into a monster, a neighbor into a traitor, an entire nation into an existential enemy. Discourse not only describes reality, it creates reality. Michel Foucault dedicated his work to analyzing how power operates through discourse. For him, institutions, whether the state, the media, religion, or the educational system, not only control bodies and actions, but also shape consciousness. They define what can be said, what can be thought, what is considered true or false, and in this process, they create the symbolic field in which the enemy will be constructed. Every sustained conflict requires a narrative. It is not enough for one group to want to combat another. It is necessary to justify that desire. And the most effective justification is one that presents itself as objective, unquestionable truth. Thus, national mythologies, religious discourses, ideological doctrines emerge that define the us and the them. The enemy is portrayed as a threat to order, morality, the very existence of the group. Every nuance, every complexity is erased. The other becomes absolute. Either they are destroyed, or they will destroy us. Zygmunt Bauman, in analyzing modernity and its horrors, showed how supposedly rational and civilized societies can be led to commit atrocities, not because their members are monsters, but because they were immersed in discourses that justified violence as an act of defense, purification, or progress. The Holocaust was not the result of blind and irrational hatred. It was meticulously prepared by a discursive apparatus that constructed the Jew as a biological threat to the purity of the nation. Similarly, the massacres in Rwanda, the Soviet purges, the colonial wars, all were preceded by campaigns of symbolic construction of the enemy. Today, in a world saturated with information, this process has not disappeared. It has only fragmented and accelerated. Social media functions as factories of enemies. Algorithms that favor polarizing content fuel anger, reinforce prejudices, and build discursive bubbles where there is no space for dialogue or empathy. The discourse of war has become commonplace. Politicians accusing their opponents of being enemies of the nation, commentators speaking of cultural war, hate campaigns that go viral in minutes. The rhetoric of elimination has become normalized, even outside the military field. Increasingly, people are led to see the world through a Manichaean lens. We are the virtuous, the enlightened, the just. They are the ignorant, the immoral, the dangerous. And the more the narrative radicalizes, the harder it becomes to recognize the humanity of the other. It is a self-reinforcing cycle, inevitably leading to conflict, whether symbolic or physical. But if discourses shape the battlefield, it is also through them that one can attempt to deactivate the mechanisms of war. To do this, it is first necessary to recognize how these narratives operate in our daily lives. even when we are not in a context of declared war. Because even in times of peace, the same patterns of hostility and division remain active. And it is precisely on this hidden dimension that we will delve deeper next. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. When we think of war, the image that arises is usually of distant battlefields, armed soldiers, tanks, and bombings. But the reality is that the impulse for conflict transcends the physical space of formal war. It seeps into everyday life, social structures, interpersonal relationships, and even our internal dialogue. War, in modernity, has become a diffuse phenomenon, an invisible presence that shapes our behavior and emotions, even in times and places considered peaceful. Every time a person feels the need to prove they are right at any cost, when one social group marginalizes another, when a discourse is constructed to humiliate or symbolically annihilate the opponent, we are witnessing small manifestations of the same pattern of hostility and division that fuels great wars. It is not an exaggeration to say that contemporary societies are immersed in a continuous symbolic war, a war of discourses, identities, status, and narratives. In the workplace, this war manifests in corrosive rivalries, power plays, and emotional sabotage. Within families, it may appear as a veiled struggle for control, recognition, and approval. In romantic relationships, it resembles a minefield of unresolved resentments, mutual accusations, and the need to win over the other instead of understanding them. And of course, in the public and political space, everyday war is even more visible. The growing polarization, fueled by algorithms and the logic of media spectacle, constantly reinforces the logic of us versus them. There are no longer adversaries with whom to engage in dialogue. There are enemies that need to be defeated. Every debate turns into a battlefield. Every difference of opinion is treated as an existential threat. Language becomes more aggressive, more laden with moralism and contempt. It is not surprising that social media has become a permanent combat arena where people wage daily wars in search of validation and symbolic victory. But this logic of war is not imposed from the outside. It resonates with something that exists within each of us. As we have seen, the impulse to project the shadow, to create enemies, and to seek moral superiority is deeply rooted in the psyche. And when the social and technological environment offers constant channels to feed these impulses, symbolic war becomes an integral part of everyday experience. The result is an emotionally exhausted society, permanently on high alert, where people become accustomed to seeing others with suspicion, hostility, or indifference. This invisible war has profound costs. It deteriorates mental health, corrodes social bonds, fuels fear, and hinders any real possibility of collective building. But if war is so ingrained in our lives, the question that arises is there a way to break this cycle? Is it possible to make these unconscious forces visible and, with that, deactivate their destructive mechanisms? The answer inevitably involves self-knowledge and the ability to integrate the shadow. And it is precisely on this that we will reflect in the next stage. If war, in all its forms, physical, symbolic, everyday, arises from deep and unconscious forces, then the true battlefield is not the external world, but our own interior. As long as these forces remain hidden, they will continue to dictate our reactions, our judgments, and our relationships. As Carl Jung taught, what does not become conscious manifests as fate. And in this case, the collective fate of humanity has been an endless cycle of conflicts and divisions. The first step to breaking this cycle is the recognition of the shadow. Not only the collective shadow, that which we project onto social groups, nations, or ideologies, but also the individual shadow, the aspects of ourselves that we prefer to deny. Fear, resentment, envy, the desire for control, the need for moral superiority. All these impulses, when unrecognized, become fuel for conflict. Awareness of this dynamic requires courage. It is not comfortable to confront one's own darkness, to recognize in oneself the same impulses we condemn in others. But it is precisely this movement that allows for transformation. The more a person is able to integrate their shadow, the freer they become from the compulsions that lead to hostility. They begin to recognize in the other not an absolute enemy, but a human being equally complex and contradictory. Freud already pointed out that civilization requires a constant repression of destructive impulses. But Jung went further, showing that repression alone is not enough. It merely feeds the return of the shadow in even more violent forms. The true solution is integration, bringing to light what has been denied, giving conscious space to the dark impulses so that they can be understood, processed, and transformed. This is a process that requires not only individual work, but also a collective effort. Societies that encourage critical reflection, empathy, authentic dialogue, and self-knowledge are more capable of reducing levels of hostility and avoiding the traps of projection. On the other hand, societies that repress questioning, that feed fear and polarization, inevitably move towards increasingly intense forms of conflict. But how to practically initiate this process of awareness and transformation? How to apply these principles not only in a personal journey, but in our relationships and in social life? To answer this question, it is necessary to explore concrete strategies, paths that allow for the reduction of bellicose impulses and the creation of spaces for reconciliation, both internal and external. This is precisely the focus of the next part. Recognizing the presence of the shadow is the first step, but the true challenge is to integrate it in a conscious and productive way. If we are unable to deal with these internal impulses, we will continue to project them onto the world, perpetuating the cycle of conflict and hostility that has marked human history. That is why the path to reducing war, both external and internal, requires a profound transformation, a commitment to self-knowledge, to the development of consciousness, and to the constant practice of empathy. The first dimension of this transformation is individual. There are no shortcuts. Each person must confront their own beliefs, fears, prejudices, and resentments. Jung warned that the shadow does not disappear, it needs to be integrated. And this only happens when we learn to observe our own thoughts and reactions, especially in moments of tension and conflict. Why do we feel anger? Why do we demonize the other? Where does this impulse to win, humiliate, or exclude come from? When we can look at these emotions without judgment, but with radical honesty, we begin to dissolve their power over us. Beyond introspective work, it is essential to develop practices that strengthen the capacity for empathy and understanding. Active listening, authentic dialogue, the willingness to see the other's perspective. All of this contributes to disarming the logic of war that prevails in so many human relationships. Genuine compassion is not a weakness, but a powerful antidote against the unconscious mechanisms that fuel conflict. However, this transformation cannot be limited to the individual. It must expand to the social and cultural structures that shape our imagination. It is necessary to question hate speech, stereotypes, and the language that constantly reinforces the logic of us against them. Educational institutions, media, politics, all these spaces need to be rethought so that they do not perpetuate the narratives of war. This requires a profound cultural change, a new way of telling our stories, a new ethics of coexistence. Practices such as peace education, the development of emotional intelligence, and the cultivation of open dialogue environments are concrete paths for this collective transformation. Societies that promote these values significantly reduce the risk of violence, not because they eliminate human impulses for conflict, but because they offer conscious means to deal with them. On a more intimate level, transformation involves a change in how we relate to ourselves. It is necessary to abandon the incessant internal battle, severe self-judgment, and emotional repression. The more a person can reconcile with their own shadow, the less need they will have to project it onto others. The result of all this is not a utopia of absolute peace, something that may never be achievable, but a more conscious society, less reactive, more capable of containing and transforming the destructive impulses that we all carry. And this is a work that never ends. It is a path, not a final destination. But for this path to make sense, it is necessary to take a step further, to reflect on how these principles can be concretely applied in our daily lives, in our relationships, at work, in politics, in culture. How can we truly live in a way less guided by the impulses of war? How can we practically create spaces of peace in a world that insists on dragging us into conflict? This is precisely what we will explore in the conclusion. Throughout this journey, we have seen that war is not an isolated phenomenon in time, nor an event exclusive to the battlefields. It is a continuous manifestation of the deeper forces that inhabit the human psyche. From the earliest tribal societies to today's social networks, the impulse to create enemies, to divide, to project onto others what we fear in ourselves, remains a recurring trait of the human condition. And this leads us to an inevitable realization. The true battlefield is not out there. It is not in the trenches, in political arenas, or in ideological confrontations. It is within each of us. As long as the shadow is not recognized and integrated, it will continue to be projected. We will continue to unconsciously seek external enemies who can bear the weight of the aspects of ourselves that we do not want to face. We will continue to be seduced by simplistic narratives of good versus evil that feed resentment, anger, and division. We will continue to be unconscious instruments of a cycle that perpetuates conflict in all its forms, from war between nations to the silent war we wage in our personal relationships and within ourselves. Transformation begins when we accept this uncomfortable truth, that the other is not the true threat, that the greatest enemy is the ignorance we have of ourselves. As Jung taught, the integration of the shadow is the path to individuation, to a state of greater wholeness and authenticity. But this path is not simple. It requires courage to look within, to confront fears and impulses that we would prefer to keep hidden. It requires humility to recognize that all of us, without exception, carry in our psyche seeds of hostility, intolerance, and violence. And it requires discipline to cultivate daily practices that help us not to act reactively, but consciously. This transformation is also collective. It is not just an individual journey, but a cultural change. We need spaces that favor self-knowledge, authentic dialogue, and empathetic listening. We need narratives that do not feed fear and hatred, but invite us to recognize our shared humanity. Every small gesture counts. The way we handle a conflict at work, the patience we offer in a difficult discussion, the choice not to perpetuate discourses that demonize the other. These are not grand actions, but it is they that, accumulated, change the fabric of human relationships. We must abandon the illusion that we will one day be able to eliminate all conflict. But it is possible and urgent to learn to deal with it in a more mature and conscious way. Because war only persists where unconsciousness reigns. Now I invite you to reflect. What patterns of conflict do you recognize in your own life? How do you deal with your own shadow? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your experience can help others see themselves more deeply. And of course, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now is the time. Here, we always seek to go beyond the surface, bringing reflections that challenge, that disturb, but that also liberate. And don't stop here. The next video is essential for those committed to this process of transformation. Watch it now. It may bring insights you have yet to explore, and that will be important on your journey.